Trucker sees a little girl stumbling in the cold. He turns pale when he sees her shirt. Big rigs rumbled down Interstate 80, a steady stream of metal giants cutting through the vast expanse of Wyoming. Among them was Betsy, a Kenworth W900, driven by a man named Jack Rourke. Jack, a trucker with 20 years under his belt, knew these roads like the back of his hand. He'd seen everything from blizzards that could freeze a man solid to sunsets that painted the sky in hues of fire. But tonight, a biting wind whipped across the plains, carrying with it the threat of an early winter storm. Jack wasn't worried. Betsy was a reliable machine, and he was a seasoned driver. He had a load of electronics bound for Chicago, a run he'd made countless times. He settled into his seat, adjusted his cap, and flipped on the radio, the twang of a country song filling the cab. He'd been on the road since dawn, stopping only for fuel and a quick bite. Loneliness was a trucker's constant companion, but Jack had learned to live with it. He filled the empty hours with music, podcasts, and the occasional chat with other truckers on the CB radio. Tonight, however, the silence felt heavier than usual. He missed his wife, Sarah, who had passed away 5 years ago. The road had been their life, a shared adventure. Now, it was just Jack and Betsy, facing the long haul alone. As darkness deepened, the wind picked up, and the first snowflakes began to fall. Jack slowed Betsy down, the headlights cutting through the swirling white. Visibility was poor, and he knew he had to be extra cautious. He scanned the road ahead, his eyes straining against the gloom. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his attention. He saw something small and indistinct near the side of the road. He squinted, trying to make it out. It looked like a child. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. A child out here, in this weather, at this hour. It was impossible. He slowed Betsy to a crawl, his eyes fixed on the figure. As he got closer, he could see that it was indeed a little girl. She was huddled on the side of the road, her thin coat offering little protection against the biting wind and falling snow. She was shivering uncontrollably, her face pale and drawn. Jack pulled Betsy over to the side of the road, his hands trembling. He couldn't understand what she was doing out here, alone and in such danger. He grabbed his flashlight and jumped out of the cab, the wind whipping at his face. "Hey," he called out, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Are you all right?" The little girl looked up, her eyes wide and frightened. She didn't speak, just stared at him, her small body shaking. Jack approached cautiously, his flashlight beam illuminating her face. He could see now that she was about 6 or 7 years old. Her hair was matted and her cheeks were flushed with cold. He noticed something else, something that made his blood run cold. She was wearing a t-shirt that was far too thin for the weather, and on the front, a name was scrawled in faded letters, Lily. Jack turned pale. He knew that name. It was the name of a little girl who had gone missing from a town 100 miles back, a case that had been all over the news for the past week. The girl's picture had been plastered on every gas station and truck stop along the highway. He had seen it himself, countless times. He looked at the little girl again, his heart pounding in his chest. It was her. It was Lily. "Lily?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The little girl nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by a surge of adrenaline. He had to get her out of the cold, get her to safety. He reached out his hand. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you warm." Lily hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. Her small hand was ice cold. Jack led her back to Betsy, his mind racing. He had to get her to the nearest town, get her to the authorities. He couldn't believe the coincidence, the sheer luck that had led him to find her. He opened the passenger door and helped Lily into the cab. He wrapped her in a blanket he kept in the truck and turned the heater up full blast. Lily huddled in the corner, her eyes still wide and frightened. Jack climbed back into the driver's seat, his hands shaking. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something more than just a little girl lost in the cold. He glanced at Lily, who was shivering despite the blanket and the heater. He noticed something else. She wasn't wearing shoes. Her bare feet were red and raw. He felt a chill run down his spine. Something was definitely wrong. This wasn't just a lost child. This was something else entirely. Jack pulled Betsy back onto the highway, his eyes constantly checking on Lily. She remained huddled in the corner, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. She was quiet, almost eerily so. He tried to talk to her, asking her where she had come from, how she had ended up on the side of the road, but she didn't respond. She just stared blankly, as if she didn't hear him. He glanced at her shirt again, the name Lily barely visible in the dim light of the cab. It was a simple, worn t-shirt, the kind a child might wear to bed. It struck him as odd that she would be wearing such a thin garment in this weather, especially without shoes. He reached for his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker, this is Betsy 19, he announced. "Anyone out there got a copy on a little girl, about 6 or 7, wearing a t-shirt that says Lily?" Static crackled from the speaker, followed by a gruff voice. "Yeah, Betsy. I heard about that girl. They've been broadcasting her picture all night, poor kid." "I think I found her," Jack said, his voice tight. "She's with me now." "That's great news, Betsy," the voice replied. "Where are you?" Jack gave his location, and the other trucker promised to notify the authorities. He knew it wouldn't be long before the police arrived. He felt a sense of relief, knowing that Lily would soon be safe, but the unease lingered. Something about Lily's demeanor, her silence, her bare feet, just didn't sit right with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He decided to pull over at the next truck stop, a small, isolated place about an hour down the road. He needed to get Lily something warm to wear, some food, and maybe try to get some answers. He pulled Betsy into the truck stop's parking lot, the only vehicle there besides a couple of other big rigs. The truck stop was old and run down, its neon sign flickering intermittently. It was the kind of place where truckers stopped for a quick cup of coffee and a bathroom break, not a place where families would stop for a meal. He helped Lily out of the cab, noticing again how small and fragile she seemed. She still didn't speak, just clung to his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. They walked into the truck stop, the bell above the door jingling a discordant tune. The inside was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and greasy food. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her expression bored. Jack led Lily to a booth and sat her down. He noticed that she was shivering again, even though it was warmer inside. He felt a pang of guilt. He should have gotten her out of the cold sooner. He went to the counter and ordered a hot chocolate for Lily and a cup of coffee for himself. He also grabbed a couple of sandwiches and a bag of chips. He figured Lily must be hungry, even if she wasn't showing it. When he returned to the booth, he found Lily staring at the jukebox in the corner. It was an old, dusty machine, the kind that played 45s. She seemed fascinated by it. Jack put the food on the table and sat down across from her. He tried again to talk to her, asking her if she wanted something to eat, but she didn't respond. She just kept staring at the jukebox. He sighed. He didn't know what to do. He felt responsible for her, but he also felt completely helpless. He decided to try a different approach. He pulled a dollar bill out of his pocket and handed it to her. "Do you want to play a song?" he asked, pointing to the jukebox. Lily looked at the dollar bill, then at the jukebox, then back at Jack. She hesitated for a moment, then took the dollar bill and walked over to the jukebox. She carefully examined the 45s, her brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, she selected one and inserted the dollar bill. The jukebox whirred to life, and a crackly old country song filled the truck stop. Lily stood there, listening to the music, her eyes closed. For the first time since he had found her, Jack saw a flicker of emotion on her face. It looked like sadness. He watched her, his heart aching for this lost child. He wondered what she had been through, what horrors she had witnessed. He knew he had to get her to safety, get her the help she needed. As the song ended, Lily opened her eyes. She turned to Jack, her gaze piercing. And then, she spoke. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack's blood ran cold. "Who's coming?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lily didn't answer. She just stared at him, her eyes filled with fear. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Lily wasn't just a lost child. She was running from something terrifying, and whatever it was coming. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. "Who's coming, Lily?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Lily remained silent, her eyes wide with fear. She clung to his hand, her grip tightening. Jack felt a surge of protectiveness towards this vulnerable child. He knew he had to get her out of there, away from whatever threat she was running from. He glanced around the truck stop. It was deserted except for the waitress, who was busy cleaning up behind the counter. He didn't see anyone suspicious, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He decided to leave. He couldn't stay there any longer, not knowing what danger might be lurking. He grabbed Lily's hand and led her out of the truck stop, back into the cold night air. As they walked back to Betsy, Jack scanned the parking lot, his eyes searching for anything out of the ordinary. He still didn't see anything suspicious, but the feeling of unease persisted. He helped Lily into the cab, then climbed in himself. He started Betsy up and pulled out of the parking lot, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. He didn't see any other vehicles following them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being pursued. He drove for several miles, his eyes glued to the road, his mind racing. He tried to make sense of what Lily had said, but her cryptic warning only deepened the mystery. Who was coming? What were they running from? He glanced at Lily, who was sitting quietly in the corner, her gaze fixed on the window. She seemed calmer now, but her eyes still held a hint of fear. He reached for his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker, this is Betsy 19, he announced. "Anyone out there got a copy?" Static crackled from the speaker, followed by a familiar voice. "Betsy, this is Roadrunner. What's your 20? "I'm about 20 miles east of Cheyenne," Jack replied. "I've got that little girl with me. I'm heading to the police station in Cheyenne." "Roger that, Betsy," Roadrunner replied. "The cops are looking for you. They want to talk to you about the girl." "I understand," Jack said. "I'll be there soon." He signed off the CB radio and gripped the steering wheel tighter. He knew he was doing the right thing, taking Lily to the authorities, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. He glanced at Lily again. She was still staring out the window, her face pale and drawn. He wondered what she was thinking, what secrets she was hiding. He reached for the radio and turned up the volume, hoping to drown out the silence in the cab. A news report was playing, talking about the missing girl, Lily. The reporter described her as a sweet, innocent child who had wandered away from her home a week ago. Jack frowned. That didn't make sense. Lily hadn't wandered away. She was running from something. He could see it in her eyes. He turned off the radio, the silence in the cab heavier than ever. He glanced at Lily again. She was still staring out the window, her eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, she gasped. "There," she whispered, pointing out the window. Jack slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked out the window, but he didn't see anything. "What is it, Lily?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lily didn't answer. She just pointed to the side of the road, her fingers shaking. Jack followed her gaze and saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure standing in the shadows, watching them. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the darkness. He was wearing a long, dark coat, and he held something in his hand. Jack couldn't see what it was, but it looked like a weapon. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He knew who it was. It was the one Lily was running from. It was the one who was coming. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, Betsy roaring to life. He sped down the highway, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The man was still there, standing in the shadows, watching them. He didn't move, didn't chase after them. He just stood there, his figure silhouetted against the moonlight, a silent, menacing presence. Jack knew they were in danger. He knew they had to get away, get to safety, but he also knew that the man wouldn't give up. He would keep coming, keep hunting them down. Jack gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was still there, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the desolate highway. He couldn't make out any details, but the man's stillness, his unwavering gaze, sent a chill down Jack's spine. He knew they were being hunted. "He's still there," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. She huddled closer to the window, her eyes wide with terror. Jack didn't reply. He focused on the road, his mind racing. He needed to get to Cheyenne, to the police station. He needed to get Lily to safety. He pressed down on the accelerator. Betsy's engine roaring in protest. The speedometer crept up, past the speed limit, but Jack didn't care. He needed to put as much distance as possible between them and the man in the shadows. He glanced in the rearview mirror again. The figure was still there, but now it was moving. It was walking towards a vehicle parked further down the road. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. The chase had begun. He knew he couldn't outrun the man forever. He was a trucker, not a race car driver. Betsy was a powerful machine, but she wasn't designed for high-speed chases. He needed a plan, a way to escape. He thought about pulling over, trying to hide, but he quickly dismissed the idea. The man knew they were on this road. He would find them. They had to keep moving. Keep heading towards Cheyenne. He reached for his CB radio. Breaker, this is Betsy 19, he announced, his voice trembling. I need help. I'm being chased. Static crackled from the speaker, followed by a chorus of voices. What's your 20, Betsy? What's going on? Who's chasing you? Jack explained the situation, his voice urgent. He told them about Lily, about the man in the shadows, about the feeling of dread that had settled over him. The other truckers responded with offers of help. They promised to keep an eye out for the man, to alert the authorities. Some even offered to intercept the man, to block his path. Jack was grateful for their support. He knew that truckers looked out for each other, that they were a community. But he also knew that this was a dangerous situation, that he couldn't rely on anyone else. He had to protect Lily. To get her to safety, he glanced at her again. She was still staring out the window, her face pale and drawn. He wondered what she was thinking, what she knew about the man who was chasing them. He tried to talk to her again, but she remained silent. She just stared out the window, her eyes filled with fear. He sighed. He knew he wouldn't get any answers from her. She was too scared, too traumatized. He had to figure this out on his own. He drove on, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. The man was still following them, his vehicle gaining ground. Jack could see now that it was a dark SUV, its headlights cutting through the darkness. He knew he had to do something, anything. He couldn't just keep driving, waiting for the man to catch up. He had to take control, to fight back. He thought about pulling over, confronting the man, but he quickly dismissed the idea. He was no match for the man. He was just a trucker, not a fighter. He needed a different plan, a way to outsmart the man. He glanced at Lily again. She was still staring out the window, but now she was pointing. She was pointing to a sign on the side of the road. It was a sign for a rest area, a small, isolated place a few miles ahead. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what he had to do. He had to take a chance. To gamble everything on a desperate plan. He slowed Betsy down, signaling his intention to turn off the highway. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The SUV was still following them, its headlights closing in. He took a deep breath and turned off the highway, heading towards the rest area. He knew it was a risk, but it was the only chance they had. Jack steered Betsy into the deserted rest area. It was a small, isolated place consisting of a few picnic tables, a restroom building, and a large, mostly empty parking lot. The only other vehicle present was a lone pickup truck parked near the restrooms. The area was dimly lit by a few scattered lights, casting long, eerie shadows. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The SUV was slowing down, its headlights illuminating the rest area entrance. He knew he had to act fast. He turned to Lily, who was still staring out the window, her eyes wide with fear. We're going to stop here for a minute, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. I need you to stay in the truck, okay? Don't go anywhere. Lily nodded, her eyes fixed on the approaching SUV. Jack climbed out of the cab, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked towards the back of Betsy, pretending to check the tires. He wanted to appear as if he had simply stopped for a routine check, not as if he was trying to hide. He glanced back at the SUV. It had pulled into the parking lot and parked a short distance away. The driver's door opened, and a figure emerged. It was the man from the highway, tall and gaunt, his face still obscured by the shadows. Jack's blood ran cold. He knew he had to act now. He couldn't stay there, waiting for the man to approach. He had to make a move, to create a diversion. He walked quickly to the restroom building, hoping the man wouldn't notice him. He slipped inside, locking the door behind him. He knew it was a risky move, but it was the only plan he could come up with. He waited inside the restroom, listening for any sounds outside. He could hear the wind whistling through the trees, the distant rumble of traffic on the highway, but nothing else. He held his breath, his ears straining for any sign of the man. After a few minutes, he cautiously opened the restroom door and peeked outside. The parking lot was still deserted. The SUV was still there, but the man was gone. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. Where was he? He scanned the area, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. He saw nothing. He decided to make a run for it. He sprinted back to Betsy, jumped into the cab, and started the engine. He glanced around one last time, but the man was still nowhere to be seen. He pulled out of the rest area, his tires screeching on the asphalt. He sped back onto the highway, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. He still didn't see the SUV, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the man reappeared. He glanced at Lily, who was sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes closed. He wondered if she knew what was happening, if she could sense the danger they were in. He drove on, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't go back to the highway. The man would be waiting for them. He needed to find another way, a way to escape. He remembered seeing a sign for a small town a few miles off the highway. He decided to take a chance, to get off the main road and try to lose the man in the back roads. He took the next exit, leaving the interstate behind. He drove down a winding country road, the darkness closing in around him. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The SUV was nowhere to be seen. He drove on, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know if he had lost the man, or if he was simply waiting for them to make a mistake. He knew one thing for sure: they were still in danger. Jack drove cautiously down the winding country road, the headlights of Betsy cutting through the thick darkness. The road was narrow and unpaved, the surrounding landscape a blur of trees and fields. He glanced in the rearview mirror frequently, but there was no sign of the SUV. He didn't know if he had truly lost the man, or if he was simply biding his time, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. He reached the small town, its name barely visible on a faded sign. Havenwood. The town appeared deserted, its streets empty, its buildings dark and silent. A single streetlight flickered at the intersection, casting an eerie glow on the deserted streets. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the gentle hum of Betsy's engine. Jack slowed down, his eyes scanning the town. He didn't see any signs of life. It was as if the town had been abandoned. He wondered where everyone was, why the streets were so empty. He drove slowly down the main street, past closed storefronts and darkened houses. The town had a strange, unsettling atmosphere, a feeling of something hidden, something unspoken. He reached the center of town, where a small park was located. He decided to pull over and stop. He needed to rest, to gather his thoughts, to figure out what to do next. He parked Betsy near the park and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. He could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, but nothing else. He turned to Lily, who was sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes closed. He wondered if she was asleep, or if she was simply lost in her own world. He reached out and gently touched her arm. She opened her eyes, her gaze blank. "We're going to stop here for a while," he said softly. "We need to rest." Lily nodded, her eyes still fixed on some unseen point. Jack climbed out of the cab and stretched his legs. He walked around Betsy, trying to shake off the tension that had gripped him for the past few hours. He felt exhausted, both physically and mentally. He had been driving for hours, his nerves on edge, his mind racing. He looked around the town again. It was still deserted. He didn't see a single person. He wondered what had happened here, why the town was so empty. He walked over to the park and sat down on a bench. He looked up at the sky, which was clear and full of stars. The stars seemed to mock him, their distant light offering no comfort, no answers. He thought about Lily, about the man who was chasing them, about the strange, deserted town. He felt a sense of dread, a feeling that they were trapped, that there was no escape. He wondered if he should try to find a place to stay, a motel or a hotel, but he quickly dismissed the idea. He didn't trust anyone in this town. He didn't know who was friend and who was foe. He decided to stay in Betsy for the night. It was the safest place he could think of. He returned to the truck and climbed into the cab. He looked at Lily, who was still sitting quietly in the corner, her eyes closed. He wondered what she was dreaming about, what secrets she was hiding. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He was exhausted, but he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. He was too worried, too afraid. He listened to the silence of the town, the whispers of the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. He felt a chill run down his spine. He knew they were in danger. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. The silence of Havenwood pressed in on Jack, heavy and unsettling. He couldn't shake the feeling that the town was holding its breath, waiting. He glanced at Lily. She was still curled up in the corner, seemingly asleep, but he couldn't be sure. Her stillness was unnerving. He tried the CB radio again, hoping to reach someone, anyone, but only static answered his calls. Havenwood felt cut off, isolated from the rest of the world. He wondered if the storm had knocked out the communication towers, or if there was another reason for the radio silence. He decided to venture out, to explore the town, to try and find some answers. He grabbed his flashlight and cautiously opened the cab door. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else. Something faintly metallic, almost like blood. He stepped out of Betsy and onto the deserted street. The silence was broken only by the crunch of his boots on the gravel. He walked slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the empty storefronts and darkened houses. The town had a strange, almost ghostly quality. It was as if time had stopped here, as if the residents had simply vanished. Leaving everything behind, he passed a diner, its windows dark, a closed sign hanging crookedly in the door. He peered inside, his flashlight beam revealing overturned tables and chairs, plates of half-eaten food still on the counters. It looked as if the diner had been abandoned in a hurry. He continued walking, his unease growing with each step. He passed a gas station, its pumps standing silent, its windows covered in grime. He noticed a newspaper lying on the ground near the pumps. He picked it up and brushed off the dust. It was an old newspaper, dated a week ago. The headline screamed about a series of disappearances in the area, people vanishing without a trace. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He knew now why the town was deserted. The residents had fled, terrified of whatever was happening here. He wondered if Lily knew anything about it, if she was connected to the disappearances. He walked back to Betsy, his mind racing. He needed to get out of Havenwood, to get Lily to safety. But he also knew that he couldn't leave without answers. He had to know what was happening here, what dark secret this town was hiding. He climbed back into the cab and looked at Lily. She was still curled up in the corner, her eyes closed. He hesitated to wake her, but he knew he had to. He needed her help. "Lily," he said softly, gently shaking her shoulder. Lily opened her eyes, her gaze blank. "Do you know anything about this town?" he asked. "Do you know why it's so empty?" Lily didn't answer, she just stared at him. Her eyes filled with a strange, unsettling emptiness. Jack sighed. He knew he wouldn't get any answers from her. She was too scared, too traumatized. He had to figure this out on his own. He decided to go to the town's only motel, a small, run-down building at the edge of town. He figured someone there might know something, might have seen something. He started Betsy up and drove slowly towards the motel. As he drove, he noticed something strange. A light was on in one of the houses, a small, unassuming house on a side street. It was the only light he had seen in the entire town. He hesitated, wondering if he should investigate. He knew it was risky, but he also knew that he couldn't ignore it. It might be a clue, a lead. He decided to take a chance. He turned off the main street and drove slowly towards the house. He parked Betsy a short distance away and turned off the engine. He grabbed his flashlight and cautiously approached the house. The house was small and old, its paint peeling, its windows dark. The only light came from a single window in the back. Jack crept towards the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he would find inside, but he knew he had to find out. Jack cautiously approached the house, his flashlight beam dancing across the overgrown yard. The single lit window at the back offered a sliver of hope, a potential answer to the mysteries of Havenwood. He reached the back of the house and peered through the window. Inside, he saw an elderly woman sitting at a table, her back to him. She was hunched over something, her movements slow and deliberate. Jack couldn't see what she was doing, but he could hear a faint scratching sound. He hesitated, unsure whether to approach. He didn't want to startle her, but he also knew he needed answers. He took a deep breath and gently knocked on the back door. The woman didn't react. She continued her task, seemingly unaware of his presence. Jack knocked again, this time louder. The woman finally turned, her face etched with wrinkles, her eyes dark and piercing. She stared at Jack, her expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy. "I'm sorry to bother you," Jack said, "but I'm just passing through. I noticed your light was on, and I was wondering if you could help me." The woman studied him for a moment, her gaze intense. "What do you want?" she asked. Jack explained that he was looking for information about the town, about the disappearances. He told her about Lily, about the man who was chasing them. The woman listened intently, her expression unchanging. When Jack finished, she was silent for a moment. Then, she nodded. "Come in," she said, opening the back door. Jack stepped inside. The house was small and cluttered, filled with old furniture and dusty knickknacks. The air was thick with the smell of herbs and something else, something vaguely medicinal. The woman led him to the table where she had been sitting. Jack saw now what she had been doing. She was cleaning a small, intricately carved wooden doll. It was similar to the one he had seen in Lily's hand. "These dolls," the woman said, her voice low, "are the key to everything." Jack frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. The woman explained that the dolls were part of an old tradition in Havenwood, a ritual designed to protect the town from evil. Each doll represented a resident of the town, and as long as the dolls were cared for, the residents were safe. But lately, the dolls had been neglected, forgotten. And as a result, the evil had returned. "The man who is chasing you," the woman said, "he is one of them. He is the one who is taking the people." Jack's blood ran cold. He realized now why Lily had been so scared, why she had been running. She knew the truth about Havenwood, about the dolls, about the man who was coming. "What can I do?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. The woman pointed to the doll she was holding. "You must find the doll that represents Lily," she said. "It is hidden somewhere in the town. Once you find it, you must bring it back here. Only then can the spell be broken, and the people of Havenwood be safe." Jack nodded, understanding dawning on him. He knew what he had to do. He had to find Lily's doll. He thanked the woman and left the house, his heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose. He returned to Betsy and told Lily what he had learned. Lily nodded, her eyes now filled with understanding. Together, they searched the town, looking for Lily's doll. They checked every house, every store, every building. Finally, they found it hidden in an old abandoned schoolhouse. It was a small, worn doll, its clothes torn, its face faded. Jack took the doll and returned to the woman's house. He handed her the doll, and she began to chant, her voice rising and falling in an ancient rhythm. As she chanted, the wind picked up, swirling around the house. The lights flickered, and the ground began to tremble. Suddenly, the door burst open, and the man from the highway stood there, his face now visible in the light. He was tall and gaunt, his eyes filled with hatred. He lunged at Jack, but the woman stepped in front of him, holding the doll high. "You have no power here," she said, her voice strong and clear. The man screamed in rage and vanished, disappearing into the darkness. The woman's chanting subsided, and the wind died down. The lights came back on. They thanked Jack and the woman for saving them. Jack and Lily left Havenwood. The town now returned to life. As they drove away, Jack looked back at the town, its secrets now revealed. He knew he would never forget Havenwood, the town of whispers, the town where he had faced his fears and discovered the truth.